The morning mist clung to the cornfields like a shroud, and Martha Henderson could taste the metallic bite of autumn in the air. October 15th, 2011 would later be remembered as the day everything changed, though at the time it felt like any other Saturday on the Henderson farm in rural Nebraska. The cornstalks stood 8 feet tall, their golden husks rustling in the pre-dawn breeze, creating a symphony that had been the soundtrack of her life for 63 years. Martha stepped onto the wraparound porch of the farmhouse, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The white clapboard siding needed paint, and the screen door still squeaked, despite her late husband's promises to fix it 3 summers ago. But the farm endured, as it always had, as it always would. At least that's what she told herself each morning when the weight of running 300 acres alone pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy quilt. The sound of boots on gravel drew her attention to the dirt road that wound between the barn and the house. Miguel Santos emerged from the morning shadows, his work jacket zipped against the chill, lunch pail swinging at his side. 28 years old, with calloused hands and kind eyes, Miguel had been working the Henderson farm for nearly 4 years. He'd arrived in the spring of 2008, speaking broken English and carrying little more than a change of clothes and a fierce determination to build something better for his family back in Guatemala. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Miguel called out, his accent softening the edges of his words. He'd learned English quickly, picking up phrases from Martha and the other seasonal workers, but his voice still carried the musical cadence of his homeland. "The corn's ready in the north field. We can start there after breakfast." Martha nodded, watching as he disappeared into the barn to begin his daily routine. She'd grown fond of Miguel over the years, the way a grandmother might grow fond of a grandson she rarely saw. He was reliable, hard-working, and possessed a gentleness with the animals that reminded her of her own son, David, who'd moved to Denver years ago and visited twice a year if she was lucky. The barn door creaked open, and Martha could hear Miguel greeting the horses, his voice soft and reassuring. Buster and Belle, the 2 quarter horses who'd been with the farm longer than Miguel, nickered in response. The sound of hay being distributed, water buckets being filled, and the gentle murmur of a man who found peace in simple routines drifted across the yard. If stories like this one touch your heart, you might want to subscribe. We share these human moments that remind us we're all connected by the threads of hope and memory. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, Martha made her way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast for the harvest crew. Today would be busy. Miguel had arranged for 3 of his cousins to help with the corn harvest, and the combine harvester was scheduled to arrive by 9 o'clock. The kitchen filled with the aroma of bacon and coffee, and Martha found herself humming an old hymn her mother used to sing during harvest season. Miguel appeared at the back door, just as she was setting plates on the table. His dark hair was already damp with sweat despite the cool morning, and there was something different about his expression, a tension she hadn't seen before. He sat down across from her, the same chair he'd occupied for nearly 4 years, but his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "You okay, Miguel?" Martha asked, studying his face. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of worry in the young man's features, the way his eyebrows drew together when he was thinking about his family, the slight downturn of his mouth when money was tight. "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson," he replied, but his voice carried a weight that contradicted his words. "Just thinking about home. My sister, she's been sick and—" He trailed off, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he couldn't voice. Martha reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? You've been like family to me these past years." Miguel looked up then, and Martha saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, fear perhaps, or maybe resignation. "I know, Mrs. Henderson. You've been very good to me, better than good." He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that working here, being part of this place, it saved my life in ways you might not understand." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. "Miguel, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Before he could answer, the rumble of diesel engines announced the arrival of the harvest crew. Miguel stood quickly, his breakfast barely touched, and grabbed his work gloves from the windowsill. "It's nothing, Mrs. Henderson. Just thinking too much. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. The corn in the north field, it's the best crop we've had in years. You should be proud. Martha watched him walk toward the barn, his shoulders set with the determined posture of a man preparing for battle. She'd seen that same stance in her husband before he'd faced difficult decisions, and it made her stomach clench with anxiety. But the day was beginning and there was work to be done. The harvest proceeded with the mechanical precision of a well-rehearsed dance. The combine harvester moved through the rows like a giant yellow beast, its rotating blades cutting through the stalks with methodical efficiency. Miguel worked alongside his cousins, guiding the machine, clearing jams, and ensuring the grain was properly collected. Martha watched from the porch, noting how Miguel seemed to memorize every detail of the process, as if he was storing the memory of this day for some future purpose. By noon, the sun had burned away the last of the morning's chill, and the workers gathered in the shade of the old oak tree for lunch. Miguel sat apart from the others, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if he expected something, or someone, to appear from the cornfields. He ate mechanically without his usual enjoyment of Martha's sandwiches and spoke only when directly addressed. "Miguel seems different today," one of his cousins, Carlos, mentioned to Martha in Spanish, assuming she wouldn't understand. But Martha had picked up enough Spanish over the years to catch the gist of most conversations. "He's been worried about his sister," she replied in English, loud enough for Miguel to hear. "Family troubles can weigh heavy on a man's heart." Miguel looked up sharply, meeting her eyes across the group. For a moment, Martha thought he might say something, might explain the tension that seemed to radiate from him like heat from summer pavement. Instead, he simply nodded and returned to his sandwich. The afternoon passed in a blur of dust and diesel fumes. The combine harvester worked its way through the north field, then moved to the smaller plots near the barn. Martha noticed that Miguel kept glancing toward the old storage barn, the one they rarely used anymore since the new equipment shed had been built. Something about his repeated looks in that direction made her uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Miguel approached Martha where she sat on the porch. The harvest was nearly complete, and the other workers were beginning to clean up their equipment. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." Martha set down her glass of lemonade and gave him her full attention. "What is it, Miguel?" He sat down on the porch steps, his work boots dusty and his shirt stained with sweat and grain dust. "I might not be here tomorrow morning?" "What do you mean?" Martha felt her heart skip a beat. "Are you quitting? Did someone offer you more money?" Miguel shook his head slowly. "It's not about money, Mrs. Henderson. It's about other things I can't explain right now." He stood up, brushing off his jeans. "But I want you to know that these have been the best years of my life. Working this land, learning from you, it's been a gift." "Miguel, you're frightening me. What's going on? Are you in some kind of trouble?" He turned to face her, and Martha saw tears gathering in his eyes. "Some troubles follow you, no matter how far you run, Mrs. Henderson. And sometimes the only way to protect the people you care about is to face those troubles head-on." Before Martha could respond, Miguel walked toward the barn, his shoulders set with that same determined posture she'd noticed all day. The other workers were loading their tools into the truck, laughing and joking about the successful harvest. But Miguel moved with the solitary purpose of a man who'd made a difficult decision. Martha watched him disappear into the barn, and something deep in her chest told her that this conversation, this moment, was more important than she understood. The October evening settled around the farm like a comfortable blanket, but underneath its familiar warmth, Martha sensed something changing, something ending. The last light of day filtered through the barn windows, casting long shadows across the hay bales and farming equipment. Miguel emerged briefly, carrying a small duffel bag she'd never seen before. He loaded it into his pickup truck, then returned to the barn. Martha could hear him moving around inside, the sound of tools being arranged, the creak of floorboards under his feet. When he finally came out, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Miguel walked to the porch where Martha still sat, waiting. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice steady now, resolved. "No matter what happens, remember that I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. And remember that some stories don't end the way we want them to, but that doesn't make them any less important." He leaned down and kissed her cheek, a gesture both tender and final. "Take care of yourself, okay? And take care of this place. It's special." Martha reached out to touch his arm, but he was already walking away toward his truck. The engine started with a familiar rumble, and Miguel drove slowly down the dirt road, his headlights sweeping across the harvested fields. At the end of the driveway, he stopped for a long moment, as if taking one last look at the farm that had been his home for 4 years. Then he was gone, leaving only the sound of crickets and the distant call of a night bird. Martha sat on the porch until well past midnight, staring at the barn and wondering what Miguel had meant by his cryptic words. Something told her that October 15th, 2011 would be remembered as more than just the day of the harvest. She was right, though not in the way she could have imagined. By morning, Miguel Santos would be gone, and the mystery of his disappearance would haunt the Henderson farm for years to come. The morning of October 16th, 2011 arrived with an unseasonable frost that turned the harvested fields into a crystalline landscape. Martha Henderson stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunrise paint the frost-covered ground in shades of pink and gold. She'd slept poorly, Miguel's words echoing in her mind, and she found herself listening for the familiar sound of his pickup truck coming up the drive. By 7 o'clock, when Miguel would normally be arriving to tend to the animals, Martha felt the first stirrings of real concern. She pulled on her coat and walked to the barn, her breath visible in the cold air. Buster and Belle greeted her with soft knickers, their water buckets empty and their feed bins undisturbed. Miguel had never, in 4 years, failed to care for the horses before attending to any other duties. Martha fed and watered the animals herself, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. She kept glancing toward the road, expecting to see Miguel's truck appear at any moment, expecting him to emerge from the barn with that sheepish smile he wore when he thought he'd overslept. But the road remained empty, and the barn held only the horses and the lingering scent of hay and leather. By noon, Martha had called the 2 numbers she had for Miguel, his cell phone, which went directly to voicemail, and the number for the small apartment he rented in town. His landlord, Mrs. Chen, spoke in broken English, but her meaning was clear. Miguel hadn't come home the night before. His bed was still made, his few belongings undisturbed. The local sheriff's department treated Miguel's disappearance with the casual attention typically reserved for missing adults. Deputy Johnson, a young man with kind eyes and a professionally neutral expression, took Martha's statement while sitting at her kitchen table. He wrote down Miguel's description: 5 feet 8 inches tall, approximately 160 pounds, black hair, brown eyes, and noted the make and model of his pickup truck. "Most of the time these situations resolve themselves within a few days," Deputy Johnson explained, closing his notebook. "Maybe he got word about his family back home, or maybe he just decided to move on. Migrant workers, they come and go. It's the nature of the work." Martha felt a flash of irritation at the casual dismissal. "Miguel wasn't just a migrant worker, Deputy. He'd been with me for 4 years. This farm was his home. He wouldn't just leave without saying goodbye." "You said he did say goodbye, Mrs. Henderson. Yesterday evening when he told you he might not be here this morning." The words stung because they were true, but Martha knew there was more to Miguel's disappearance than a simple decision to move on. The fear in his eyes, the way he'd glanced repeatedly toward the old barn, the careful way he'd spoken about troubles following him. These weren't the actions of a man planning a routine departure. The search began small and grew gradually more intensive as the days passed. Martha contacted everyone she could think of, other farmers who employed seasonal workers, the small community of Guatemalan immigrants who'd settled in the county, even the Catholic church where Miguel occasionally attended services. No one had seen him since the harvest. Carlos, Miguel's cousin, proved to be the most helpful. He spoke English well and served as a translator when Martha met with other members of Miguel's extended family. They gathered in the community center on a Thursday evening, 6 days after Miguel's disappearance, their faces etched with worry and confusion. "Miguel, he never talked about going anywhere," Carlos said, his voice heavy with concern. He was saving money to bring his sister to America. She's sick, needs an operation. He wouldn't leave without telling us, without making arrangements. An older woman named Rosa, who'd known Miguel since he'd first arrived in Nebraska, spoke rapidly in Spanish. Carlos translated. She says Miguel was afraid of something these past few weeks. He kept asking about strangers in town, people asking questions about workers. He thought maybe immigration was planning a raid. Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. What kind of strangers? Men in suits, driving expensive cars. They visited some of the farms, asking about workers' documentation. Miguel, he had all his papers, but he was still nervous. The revelation added a new dimension to the mystery. Had Miguel fled to avoid immigration trouble? But that didn't explain the duffel bag he'd loaded into his truck, or the way he'd spoken about protecting people he cared about. As the second week of the search began, Martha found herself spending more and more time in the barn. Something about the space drew her, the way Miguel had kept glancing toward it on his last day. She searched through every corner, every stall, looking for some clue that might explain his disappearance. But the barn held only the familiar detritus of farm life, old tools, hay bales, the scent of horses and leather. The local newspaper ran a small article about Miguel's disappearance, accompanied by a grainy photograph Martha had taken the previous Christmas. The headline read, "Local Farm Worker Missing," and the article mentioned the ongoing search efforts. But as the days passed, the story faded from public attention, relegated to the back pages of the weekly edition. Martha refused to give up. She spent her evenings driving the county roads, searching for any sign of Miguel's truck. She visited truck stops and diners, showing his photograph to waitresses and cashiers. She even drove to the next county, expanding her search radius, but the trail remained cold. The horses seemed to sense something was wrong. Buster and Belle stood at the fence line each morning, looking toward the road as if they too were waiting for Miguel's return. Their behavior broke Martha's heart in ways she couldn't fully explain. The farm felt empty without Miguel's presence, his gentle voice calling to the animals, his quiet humming as he worked. 3 weeks after Miguel's disappearance, Martha received a call from the sheriff's department. A farmer in the next county had found an abandoned pickup truck in a remote section of his property, hidden in a grove of trees near a creek. The license plate matched Miguel's truck. Martha drove to the location with Deputy Johnson, her heart pounding as they approached the vehicle. The truck sat at an angle, its front wheels in the creek bed, as if it had been driven there in darkness. The doors were unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. Miguel's work gloves lay on the passenger seat, and his thermos, the one Martha had given him the previous Christmas, sat in the cup holder, still half full of coffee. "Looks like he left in a hurry," Deputy Johnson observed, photographing the scene. "Or maybe he was meeting someone here." Martha peered into the truck bed, noting the absence of the duffel bag Miguel had loaded on his last evening. "His bag isn't here, the one he put in the truck before he left." The deputy made a note in his file, but Martha could see he was already forming conclusions. To him, this was evidence of a planned departure, not a crime scene. Miguel had driven to this remote location, met someone, and left voluntarily. The case would soon be closed, filed away with other missing persons who'd chosen to disappear. But Martha knew better. She'd seen the fear in Miguel's eyes, heard the resignation in his voice. This wasn't the scene of a planned departure. It was the scene of something much more sinister. As autumn deepened into winter, the search efforts dwindled. The sheriff's department officially classified Miguel's case as a voluntary missing person, and the community gradually stopped asking about him. But Martha couldn't let go. She kept Miguel's photograph on her kitchen table, and she continued to drive the county roads, searching for answers that seemed to recede further with each passing day. The first snow of the season fell on Thanksgiving Day, covering the farmyard in a blanket of white that would have delighted Miguel. He'd told Martha once that he'd never seen snow before coming to Nebraska, and his childlike wonder at the first flakes had made her laugh. Now, watching the snow accumulate on the barn roof, Martha felt only the hollow ache of unanswered questions. Winter settled over the Henderson farm like a heavy silence, and Miguel Santos remained missing, his fate unknown. But Martha Henderson didn't give up hope. She couldn't. Something deep in her heart told her that Miguel's story wasn't finished, that somewhere in the events of October 15, 2011, lay clues that would eventually lead to the truth. She was right, though it would take 6 long years for those clues to surface. The summer of 2017 arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the Nebraska cornfields like water. Martha Henderson, now 69 and moving with the careful deliberation of age, stood in the shade of the old oak tree, watching her grandson Tommy work on the barn roof. The boy, though at 22 he was hardly a boy anymore, had come to spend the summer helping with farm maintenance, a gesture that touched Martha's heart more than she could express. 6 years had passed since Miguel's disappearance, and while the acute pain of his absence had mellowed into a dull ache, Martha still thought of him every day. She'd never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the truth would surface. But as the years passed, hope had become a more fragile thing, requiring conscious effort to maintain. Tommy descended the ladder, his t-shirt soaked with sweat, and wiped his face with a towel. "Grandma, that section of the roof is worse than I thought. The support beams are rotted through in places. I think we need to tear out a whole section of the wall to get to them properly." Martha nodded, studying the old barn that had stood on the property for over 70 years. The structure had weathered countless storms, but time was finally catching up with it. "Do what you need to do, Tommy. This old place has been good to us. We owe it some care." The work began the next morning, with Tommy carefully removing the weathered siding from the barn's north wall. Martha brought him regular glasses of ice water and watched as he methodically exposed the internal framework of the building. The craftsmanship of the original builders was evident in the hand-hewn beams and carefully joined timbers, but decades of moisture had taken their toll. "Look at this, Grandma," Tommy called out around noon, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "There's something weird about this wall." Martha walked over to where Tommy was working. He'd removed a section of the outer siding, revealing the interior wall structure. But instead of the expected framework, they found a second wall, built closer to the interior of the barn than the original construction would have required. "It's like someone built a wall inside the original wall," Tommy explained, running his hands along the newer lumber. "See how this wood is different? It's not as old as the rest of the barn." Martha studied the construction, her mind racing. The inner wall was made of more recent lumber, though it had been stained and treated to blend with the older wood. Unless someone looked closely, as Tommy was doing now, the modification would be nearly invisible. "Can you take this inner wall down?" Martha asked, her voice tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Tommy nodded, reaching for his crowbar. "It's not structural, just nailed to the original frame. Should come down pretty easy." As Tommy worked to remove the boards, Martha felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with dread. Something about this hidden wall felt significant, connected to memories she'd tried to suppress. Miguel's last day, the way he'd kept glancing toward the barn, the finality in his voice when he'd said goodbye. The first board came away with a screech of nails being pulled from wood. Tommy set it aside and moved to the next one. "There's definitely space behind here, Grandma. Like a little room or something." Martha's heart began to race. "Keep going, Tommy, but be careful." As more boards came away, a small chamber was revealed, roughly 4 feet wide and extending the full height of the barn wall. The space was dark and musty, filled with the scent of old wood and something else Martha couldn't identify. Tommy pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the hidden compartment. "Holy shit," Tommy whispered, then quickly glanced at his grandmother. "Sorry, Grandma, but look at this." The phone's light revealed scratches and marks carved into the wood of the original barn wall. At first, they looked like random scratches, the kind that might be made by animals or weather. But as Martha's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized they were deliberate markings, carved with purpose and intention. "Get a better light," Martha said, her voice barely audible. "Your grandfather's old work light is in the tool shed." Tommy ran to fetch the light, and Martha stood alone in front of the hidden chamber, her mind reeling. The markings on the wood seemed to pulse with significance, though she couldn't yet make out what they said. When Tommy returned with the powerful LED work light, Martha felt as if she were about to open a door that had been sealed for 6 years. The bright light revealed the truth with stunning clarity. Carved into the wood in letters that varied from careful script to desperate scratches was a message. "My name is Miguel Santos. I worked for Martha Henderson. They took me October 15th, 2011. I am hidden in the barn. If you find this, tell Martha I am sorry. Tell her I tried to protect her. They said they would hurt her if I didn't come with them. I hope she forgives me. I hope someone finds this." Below the message, in smaller, more frantic scratches, were additional words. "Carlos knows. Ask Carlos about the men in suits. They were not immigration. They were something else. I should have told Martha. I should have trusted her. I am sorry." Martha's legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, her hands covering her face. The message on the wall answered some questions but raised so many more. Miguel had been taken, held against his will. But by whom? And why? The implications of his words crashed over her like a wave. "Grandma?" Tommy's voice seemed to come from far away. "Grandma, are you okay?" Martha looked up at her grandson, seeing the concern in his young face. "Call the sheriff's department, Tommy. Call them right now. And then call Carlos Santos. His number is in my address book in the kitchen." As Tommy made the calls, Martha studied the carved message, her mind processing the implications. Miguel had been held in this barn, in this hidden space, for some unknown period of time. He'd been taken by men who'd threatened to hurt her if he didn't cooperate. The realization that Miguel had sacrificed himself to protect her was both heartbreaking and overwhelming. But the message raised more questions than it answered. If Miguel had been held here, what had happened to him after he'd carved these words? Had he escaped? Had he been moved? Or had something worse occurred? The sheriff's department arrived within an hour, led by Sheriff Morrison, who'd taken over the department 3 years earlier. He was a thorough man, older and more experienced than Deputy Johnson had been, and he treated the discovery with the seriousness it deserved. "This changes everything," Sheriff Morrison said, photographing the carved message. "This is evidence of a crime. We'll need to process this entire area, search for any other evidence." Carlos arrived shortly after the sheriff, his face grave as he read the message on the wall. When Sheriff Morrison asked him about the men in suits Miguel had mentioned, Carlos's expression grew even more troubled. "Miguel was right to be afraid," Carlos said quietly. "Those men, they weren't from immigration. They were asking too many questions, offering too much money for information about specific workers. Miguel thought they might be connected to something bad from back home." "What kind of something bad?" Sheriff Morrison asked. Carlos hesitated, glancing at Martha before answering. "Miguel never told me details, but he said there were people from Guatemala who might be looking for him. People connected to the gangs, maybe. Or the cartels. He'd witnessed something or knew something that made him dangerous to them." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Miguel had been found by people from his past, people who'd used threats against Martha to ensure his cooperation. But the carved message suggested he'd been held in the barn for some period of time. What had happened during that time? And what had become of him afterward? The investigation that followed was more thorough than the original search had been. Sheriff Morrison's team processed the hidden chamber for evidence, finding traces of blood on the floor and signs that someone had indeed been held there for an extended period. They also found remnants of rope, suggesting Miguel had been restrained. But despite the evidence of a crime, Miguel's ultimate fate remained unknown. The carved message provided proof that he'd been kidnapped, but it didn't reveal what had happened to him after he'd written those desperate words on the barn wall. As the summer of 2017 gave way to autumn, Martha found herself returning again and again to the barn, to the hidden chamber where Miguel had left his final message. The space had been sealed up again after the investigation, but Martha knew it was there, knew that Miguel's words remained carved into the wood like a permanent reminder of his courage and sacrifice. The discovery had brought some answers, but it had also opened new wounds. Knowing that Miguel had been taken, that he'd been held against his will while trying to protect her, filled Martha with a guilt that threatened to consume her. If only she'd pressed him more about his fears. If only she'd understood the danger he was in, maybe she could have helped him. But mixed with the guilt was a renewed sense of purpose. Miguel's message had been found, his story partially told. Now it was up to Martha to ensure that his sacrifice wasn't forgotten, that his courage in the face of danger was remembered. The truth about Miguel Santos was still incomplete, but at least now the world knew that he hadn't simply vanished. He'd been taken, and he'd fought to leave a message that would eventually be found. The autumn of 2017 brought with it a bittersweet resolution to 6 years of wandering. Miguel's story had been partially told, but Martha suspected that the full truth was still waiting to be discovered. The winter of 2017 brought with it a relentless investigation that transformed the Henderson farm into a crime scene. Sheriff Morrison had assembled a team of state investigators, FBI agents and forensic specialists who methodically searched every inch of the property. The barn in particular received intensive scrutiny, with experts examining the hidden chamber where Miguel had carved his desperate message. Martha watched the investigation unfold from her kitchen window, her heart heavy with the weight of revelation. The discovery of Miguel's message had answered the question of whether he'd left willingly, but it had opened a chasm of new uncertainties. The evidence suggested he'd been held captive for some time, but what had happened to him afterward remained a mystery that seemed to grow more complex with each passing day. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Carlos Santos, driven by guilt over his cousin's fate, had spent weeks reaching out to contacts in the Guatemalan community across the Midwest. His persistence paid off when he connected with a woman named Eleanor, who'd been working at a meat processing plant in Iowa during the fall of 2011. Eleanor's story, told to Sheriff Morrison through Carlos's translation, painted a picture of a criminal network that had been operating in the shadows of the agricultural community. She spoke of men who'd come to the plant, asking questions about specific workers, offering money for information about people who might be vulnerable to pressure. They were looking for people who had something to hide, Elena explained, her voice trembling with remembered fear. People who'd witnessed things back home, people who might be valuable to them. Miguel's name came up because someone knew he'd seen something in Guatemala, something that made him dangerous to certain people. The investigation revealed that Miguel had indeed witnessed a crime in Guatemala, a murder committed by members of a drug cartel who'd been expanding their operations into rural communities. Miguel had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and his decision to flee to the United States had been motivated by more than just economic opportunity. He'd been running for his life. But the cartel's reach had eventually extended into the American Midwest, following the same routes that brought migrant workers to the agricultural heartland. The men in suits who'd been asking questions about workers hadn't been immigration agents. They'd been cartel operatives searching for witnesses who might pose a threat to their operations. Sheriff Morrison's team worked with federal agents to piece together the timeline of events. Miguel had been taken from his truck on the night of October 15, 2011, by men who'd been watching him for weeks. But instead of killing him immediately, they'd brought him back to the Henderson farm, using the barn as a temporary holding facility while they decided what to do with him. They kept him alive because they needed information, Sheriff Morrison explained to Martha during one of their regular briefings. They wanted to know what he'd seen, who he'd told, whether there were others who might be threats to their operation. The hidden chamber in the barn had been constructed specifically to hold Miguel, a makeshift prison where he could be interrogated without being seen. The cartel operatives had been careful, professional, ensuring that their activities wouldn't draw attention from the local community. But Miguel had been clever too. The carved message on the wall represented more than just a desperate cry for help. It was a deliberate act of resistance, a way of ensuring that his story would eventually be told. The varying quality of the lettering suggested he'd worked on it over several days, carving when he was alone and his captors were absent. The investigation also revealed the full extent of Miguel's sacrifice. Phone records and witness statements suggested that the cartel operatives had indeed threatened to harm Martha if Miguel didn't cooperate. His willingness to go with them voluntarily, his careful goodbye on that last evening, had been motivated by a desire to protect the woman who'd become like a grandmother to him. He could have warned you, Sheriff Morrison said gently. He could have told you what was happening and asked for help. But he was afraid that involving you would put you in danger. The revelation broke Martha's heart in ways she hadn't expected. Miguel's final act of love had been to protect her, even at the cost of his own life. The guilt she'd carried for 6 years, the sense that she should have done more, should have understood his fear, was replaced by a different kind of grief, one tinged with gratitude for his sacrifice. But the investigation still hadn't answered the ultimate question. What had happened to Miguel after he'd carved his message? The forensic evidence suggested he'd been held in the barn for at least a week, possibly longer. But then the trail went cold, the physical evidence providing no clues about his ultimate fate. The answer came from an unexpected source. A former cartel operative, arrested in California on unrelated charges, decided to cooperate with federal agents in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony, corroborated by other intelligence, provided the final pieces of Miguel's story. According to the informant, Miguel had been killed after approximately 2 weeks in captivity. The cartel operatives had extracted what information they could from him, but they'd ultimately decided he was too dangerous to release. His body had been disposed of in a remote location, hundreds of miles from the Henderson farm. They were professionals, the informant explained to federal agents. They knew that leaving bodies behind would draw attention. They had procedures for disposal, ways of making people disappear completely. The news of Miguel's confirmed death hit Martha like a physical blow. She'd known, intellectually, that he was probably dead. 6 years of silence had made that reality almost inevitable. But having it confirmed, knowing the circumstances of his final weeks, brought a grief that threatened to overwhelm her. Yet there was also a strange sense of relief. The uncertainty was over. Miguel's story, tragic as it was, had been told. His courage in the face of death, his willingness to sacrifice himself to protect others, would not be forgotten. The federal investigation expanded beyond Miguel's case, uncovering a network of cartel operations that had been targeting vulnerable immigrants across the agricultural Midwest. Miguel's death had not been in vain. His carved message had provided crucial evidence that helped authorities dismantle a criminal organization responsible for numerous disappearances and deaths. Carlos Santos became an advocate for immigrant workers' rights, using his cousin's story to highlight the dangers faced by vulnerable communities. He worked with law enforcement agencies to develop better protection protocols for witnesses and potential targets of cartel violence. Miguel died protecting others, Carlos said during a community meeting in the spring of 2018, but his story also protects people now. When workers know there are people watching out for them, when they know their safety matters, it makes them less vulnerable to these predators. The Henderson farm became a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. Martha established a small memorial in the barn near the spot where Miguel's message had been found. It consisted of a simple plaque bearing his name and the dates of his birth and death, along with the words, "He died protecting others." Sheriff Morrison's investigation also led to policy changes in how missing persons cases involving immigrant workers were handled. The casual dismissal that had characterized the initial response to Miguel's disappearance was replaced by protocols that took such cases seriously from the outset. "Every missing person deserves the same level of attention," Sheriff Morrison said during a press conference announcing the new policies. Miguel Santos's case taught us that assumptions about why people disappear can blind us to the truth. We won't make that mistake again. As the investigation wound down in the summer of 2018, Martha found herself returning often to the barn, to the memorial she'd created for Miguel. The space felt different now, no longer haunted by uncertainty, but blessed by the knowledge that Miguel's sacrifice had meaning. The horses, Buster and Belle, had grown old in the years since Miguel's disappearance. They seemed to understand that their caretaker was never coming back, but they still approached the memorial with a gentle curiosity that touched Martha's heart. Sometimes she imagined she could hear Miguel's voice in the barn, humming the old songs he'd loved, speaking gently to the animals he'd cared for. The carved message in the wall had been preserved, though it was no longer visible behind the restored barn siding. Martha knew it was there, though. Miguel's words etched permanently into the wood, a testament to his courage and his love for the people he'd tried to protect. Tommy returned to help with the farm work the following summer, and Martha was struck by how much he'd matured since discovering Miguel's message. The experience had changed him. given him a deeper understanding of the complexities of life and the courage it sometimes takes to do the right thing. "Do you think Miguel knew?" Tommy asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the cornfields gold. "Do you think he knew that his message would eventually help other people?" Martha considered the question, thinking about Miguel's final days, his decision to leave a record of what had happened to him, despite the danger it might have posed to his captors' plans. "I think Miguel knew that truth has power," she said finally. "Even when we can't see how that truth will be used, even when we're afraid that no one will ever find it." He carved those words because he believed they mattered, because he believed that someone someday would care enough to look for answers. The autumn of 2018 marked 7 years since Miguel's disappearance, and Martha organized a small memorial service in his honor. The community that had gathered to search for him in 2011 came together again, this time to celebrate his life and mourn his death properly. Carlos spoke about his cousin's dreams, his plans to bring his sick sister to America, his love for the land he'd worked and the people he'd served. Other community members shared memories of Miguel's kindness, his gentle way with animals, his willingness to help neighbors in need. But it was Martha who spoke the words that would be remembered long after the service ended. "Miguel Santos taught me that heroism doesn't always look the way we expect it to," she said, her voice carrying across the small gathering. "Sometimes it looks like a young man who goes quietly into danger to protect people he loves. Sometimes it looks like words carved into a wall in a moment of desperation, words that carry hope even in the darkest circumstances." She paused, looking out at the faces gathered around Miguel's memorial, people who'd been touched by his story, even if they'd never met him. "Miguel's message wasn't just a cry for help," Martha continued. "It was an act of faith, faith that someone would find it, faith that his truth would matter, faith that his sacrifice would have meaning. That faith has been vindicated. Miguel's story has saved lives, changed policies, and reminded us all that every person matters, regardless of where they come from or what papers they carry." As the service concluded and the community dispersed, Martha remained at the memorial, her hand resting on the plaque bearing Miguel's name. The barn around her seemed filled with presence, with the echo of his voice and the memory of his gentle hands caring for the animals he'd loved. The investigation was closed, the questions answered, the truth revealed. But Miguel's legacy lived on in the changed policies, the protected workers, and the community that had learned the true meaning of courage through his sacrifice. Martha Henderson would continue to tend the farm for several more years, always mindful of the young man who'd called it home, who'd died protecting the people he loved. And in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the corn and the horses nickered softly in their stalls, she could almost hear Miguel's voice, gentle and reassuring, telling her that some stories, even the tragic ones, have the power to change the world. Spring returned to the Henderson farm in 2019 with a tenderness that seemed to acknowledge all the grief and growth the land had witnessed. Martha, now 71, moved through her morning routines with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to appreciate the weight of each ordinary moment. The barn, once a source of mystery and heartache, had become a place of quiet pilgrimage where the truth lived carved in wood beneath fresh siding. 3 years had passed since Miguel's message was discovered, and 2 years since the investigation concluded with the confirmation of his death. The federal case had wrapped up with multiple arrests and convictions, the cartel network dismantled, and new protections put in place for vulnerable immigrant workers. But for Martha, the real resolution had come not from justice served, but from understanding finally flowered after years of wondering. The memorial plaque in the barn had been joined by something unexpected: letters. They arrived sporadically throughout the year, addressed to Martha Henderson, sent by people who'd heard Miguel's story through news reports, community presentations, or word of mouth. Some were from other immigrant workers sharing their own fears and struggles. Others came from families who'd lost loved ones to similar violence, finding comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their grief. One letter, written in careful English by a young woman named Maria, had particularly moved Martha. Maria worked on a farm in Iowa and wrote that Miguel's story had given her the courage to report suspicious men who'd been asking questions about workers in her community. Her tip had led to arrests that prevented other disappearances. "Your Miguel saved my life," Maria had written. "He saved lives of people he never met, people he'll never know about. But we know about him. We remember." Martha kept these letters in a wooden box her late husband had made, reading them when the silence of the farm grew too heavy. They reminded her that Miguel's story had rippled outward from that small barn in ways neither of them could have imagined when he'd carved his desperate message into the wood. Tommy, now 25 and working as a social worker in Omaha, visited the farm regularly. The discovery of Miguel's message had profoundly shaped his career choice, leading him to specialize in services for immigrant communities. He often brought colleagues to see the memorial, using Miguel's story to help them understand the complex dangers faced by the families they served. "It's different when you can touch the place where it happened," Tommy explained to Martha during one of these visits. "When you can see the actual wall where he carved those words. It makes the statistics and case files feel real, feel human." Martha nodded, understanding what he meant. The barn had become more than a memorial. It was a classroom, a place where the abstract concept of immigrant vulnerability became concrete and personal. Sheriff Morrison still brought training groups through occasionally, using the site to teach officers about the importance of taking missing persons cases seriously, regardless of the victim's immigration status. Carlos Santos had become a frequent visitor to the farm, sometimes bringing his own children to teach them about their Uncle Miguel's courage. His daughter, Isabella, now 15, had written a school report about Miguel that won a statewide contest on immigration history. She'd titled it "The Message in the Wall," and her teacher had arranged for her to present it at the state capitol. "Uncle Miguel never got to meet us," Isabella had said during her presentation, "but his story taught us about sacrifice and courage. It taught us that ordinary people can be heroes, even when no one's watching, even when they think no one will ever know what they did." The presentation had led to additional recognition for Miguel's story. The Nebraska Historical Society created a small exhibit about his case, and several universities included it in their curriculum about immigrant experiences in rural America. Miguel Santos, who'd lived quietly and worked humbly, had become an unlikely symbol of courage and sacrifice. Martha often reflected on the irony that Miguel, who'd spent his final weeks in forced silence, had ultimately found such a powerful voice. His carved message had spoken across years, reaching people he'd never met, changing lives he'd never touched. The words he'd etched in desperation had become a declaration of faith that echoed far beyond the walls that contained them. The farm itself had changed in subtle ways since Miguel's story became known. More visitors came now, not tourists exactly, but people seeking connection to something meaningful. Some were researchers or journalists. Others were families who'd experienced similar losses. A few were simply individuals who'd heard the story and felt compelled to visit the place where such courage had been demonstrated. Martha welcomed them all, understanding that the farm was no longer just her home. It had become a site of remembrance, a place where Miguel's sacrifice could be honored and his lesson shared. She'd established a small fund to help immigrant families facing crisis, supported by donations from visitors who were moved by Miguel's story. The horses, Buster and Belle, had both passed away in the intervening years, their deaths marking the end of an era. Martha had buried them near the old oak tree, and she often thought about how Miguel would have grieved their passing. He'd loved those horses with the tender attention of someone who understood that caring for vulnerable creatures was both privilege and responsibility. New horses grazed in the pasture now, rescues from a nearby sanctuary that Martha had begun supporting. She'd named them Hope and Memory, and watching them run across the fields filled her with a bittersweet joy that she thought Miguel would have appreciated. As autumn approached in 2019, Martha began planning a special commemoration for the 8th anniversary of Miguel's disappearance. She wanted to do something that would honor not just his memory, but also the ongoing work his story had inspired. After much consideration, she decided to plant a memorial garden near the barn, with flowers that would bloom each spring in remembrance of his life. The planning brought together the extended community that had formed around Miguel's story. Carlos and his family, Tommy and his colleagues, Sheriff Morrison, various immigrant advocacy groups and community members who'd been touched by the case all contributed ideas and labor. Miguel loved growing things, Carlos said as they laid out the garden plan. He always talked about the farm in Guatemala where he grew up, how his grandmother taught him to coax flowers from difficult soil. He would have loved this. The garden was planted on October 15, 2019, exactly 8 years after Miguel's disappearance. The ceremony was simple, but deeply moving, with each participant planting bulbs that would bloom the following spring. Martha chose daffodils, remembering how Miguel had marveled at their appearance each year, their ability to push through snow and frozen ground to announce winter's end. As the sun set on that anniversary day, Martha stood alone in the barn, her hand resting on Miguel's memorial plaque. The space around her seemed filled with presence, not just Miguel's, but all the lives he'd touched through his sacrifice, all the people who'd been protected because his message had been found and his story told. "You did it, Miguel," she whispered to the silence. "You saved people. You saved me, and you saved so many others. Your message made it through." Outside, the memorial garden lay dormant under its covering of autumn leaves, holding within its soil the promise of spring blooms that would carry Miguel's memory forward into another year, another season of growth and remembrance. The years that followed would bring more changes to the Henderson farm. Martha would eventually retire from active farming, leasing the land to a young couple who committed to maintaining Miguel's memorial and continuing the advocacy work his story had inspired. She would move to a small house in town, but would visit the farm regularly, tending Miguel's garden and welcoming visitors who came to learn about his courage. Tommy would continue his work with immigrant communities, eventually establishing a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting vulnerable workers from the kind of violence that had claimed Miguel's life. The organization would be named the Miguel Santos Foundation, and its logo would feature a simple image of words carved in wood, a reminder that truth, once spoken, can never be silenced. Carlos would become a community leader, serving on various boards and committees dedicated to immigrant rights and worker protection. He would often speak about his cousin's legacy, emphasizing that heroism could be found in ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when faced with impossible choices. And in the barn at the Henderson farm, behind the fresh siding and beneath the memorial plaque, Miguel's message would remain carved in the wood, a permanent testament to the power of hope, the importance of truth, and the enduring impact of love willing to sacrifice everything for others. The story of Miguel Santos had begun with a disappearance and ended with a discovery, but its true power lay in everything that had happened in between: the search for truth, the refusal to give up hope, and the transformation of tragedy into purpose. His message, carved in desperation, had become a beacon of hope for others facing similar darkness. Some stories, Martha had learned, don't end when the last word is spoken or the final fact uncovered. Some stories continue to grow, generation after generation, carried forward by the people who refuse to let courage be forgotten or sacrifice go unremembered. Miguel Santos had lived quietly, worked humbly, and died bravely, but his true legacy lay not in the manner of his death, but in the life his story continued to live in the hearts and actions of those who heard it and chose to be changed by it. In the end, perhaps that was the most powerful message of all, that one person's courage, preserved in words carved into wood, could echo across years and touch countless lives, proving that no act of love, no matter how small or desperate, is ever truly lost.